I'm not going to speak long because usually a conversation is more interesting. And, as president, I'm no longer obligated, as a former president, I'm no longer obligated to have I was always extraordinarily proud to highlight the great alliance and friendship between Canadians and Americans. Canada was the first country I visited after I took office. It was in February. I was not happy with the weather, but the warmth of the people almost made up for it. I understand that you just got through a heat wave, but I am from Hawaii, so I don't mind. Last year, Michelle and I were delighted to host Justin and Sophie Trudeau for the first official visit and state dinner with Canada in the United States in nearly 20 years. I was given the great honor of addressing the Canadian Parliament. And most importantly, my brother-in-law is from Burlington. Me and Canada, we just have this thing. And I look forward to sitting down with Bruce to take some questions and have a discussion. I know that Canada 2020's goal is to build a community of progressive ideas and people that can make government a force for good in people's lives. And you may not be surprised that I share that goal, especially now. There's a lot that policymakers can do to make it easier for our people to succeed, to match the pace of globalization and technological change with social change and ethical and moral leadership, to meet transnational challenges like terrorism and growing economic inequality. Because in many ways, this is both the worst of times and the best of times. The world has never been more prosperous than it is today. But that has come with industrial disruptions and wage stagnation across most advanced economies. And that leaves a lot of workers and communities fearful of diminishing prospects, not just for themselves, but more importantly for their children. The world is more connected than ever before. But even as the internet has the capacity to spread knowledge and link people in ways that they could have never imagined even 15 or 20 years ago, it also empowers those who wish to spread hatred and death. And in our countries, threatens to further balkanize our politics in a way that's contrary to basic democratic principles. It's an age of instant information where TV and Twitter can feed us a steady stream of vile and bad news and insult. And so it's natural in all these disruptions, cultural, economic, for many to seek to impose some sense of certainty and control in our lives. And that alongside these economic and technological disruptions, we start seeing political and social disruptions as well. And the question we all face then is, both for individual families, but also for our body politics, do we still have the capacity to rebuild our social and political arrangements to meet the times? Can we make sure that these changes work for everyone and not just some? Can we make sure that new wonders like the internet or services on demand or driverless cars or drone deliveries help lift all boats and not just some? Can we prove that in a shrinking world where cultures are continually colliding, that a turn to a crude nationalism or xenophobia or a politics of us versus them will take us backwards and not serve the interests of people, while the values of pluralism and tolerance and rule of law, empathy, can take us forward? Can we remake our politics in a way that inspires people to reach across our divides and recognize that common thread of humanity and ensure that rather than resort to fear, we reach for hope? As I indicated before, I don't have to bore you with a 10-point plan, but I do have a few ideas I just want to note before we have our conversation that I think will make a difference. First, as we think about how we're going to rearrange our politics and our social arrangements to meet the moment, we have to focus on the economy of the United States, of Canada, and the globe, and make sure that new economy works for everybody and not just the few. Capitalism and open markets are the greatest wealth generator that the world has ever seen. They've raised standards of living around the globe. But the march of globalization and automation will only accelerate. And these forces have weakened the position of workers around the world to secure fair wages and benefits. A world where 1% or less controls as much wealth as everybody else will not be stable politically or socially. And the good news is that there's something we can actually do about it. An economy that doesn't grow as fast when just a few prosper at the expense of the many can be replaced with an economy that does, in fact, accelerate opportunity for everyone. In fact, this society doesn't work as well when people feel like the economic game is fixed. It's a recipe for more cynicism and more polarization, less trust in our institutions and each other. And by the way, it is part of the reason that we're seeing certain proposals take hold, like walking away from free trade or walling off the rest of the world, because people feel frustrated and they don't feel like their leaders are responsive. So going forward, we have to build new social compacts. We know how to do it, to give all of our young people the education that they need, to give workers the power to organize for better wages, and to reform tax codes so that those who reap the most from a new economy can avoid their obligations to the countries that made their success possible. We have to invest in our people, in their skills, in their education, in their capacity to take an idea and turn it into a business. And in a service-based economy, we have to modernize the safety net that allows people to move to jobs or locations and not feel as if they're putting everything at risk. And just as we work to reduce inequality at home, we also have to do more to close the gap between rich and poor nations. Because helping emerging economies become markets for our goods, keeping fragile states from collapsing in the first place, is not just the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do. It is not just charity, but it is also in our self-interest. That brings me to my second point. Most of our biggest challenges are going to require international cooperation. And obviously, the best example is in the area of climate change. Stronger hurricanes, longer wildfire seasons, brutal Canadian heat waves in September. We can't attribute any single one of these events to climate change, but we know that a warming planet will lead to these things happening with greater frequency. They are the future. And in recent years, the good news is we've proven that environmental protection and economic progress does not have to be contradictory, that they can be complementary concepts. But we can't solve the problem without China or without India or other developing countries. We have to work in concert with other nations to lower our carbon emissions enough to buy some time to develop the next job-creating clean energy breakthroughs. And that requires ongoing cooperation, and it requires us caring about what's happening to the people in those countries. When I helped to forge the Paris Accord, one of the biggest challenges was getting India involved. If I am not aware that Prime Minister Modi still has 4 or 5 or 600 million people without electricity, and if I'm not concerned about that, then I'm not going to be able to convince him to get involved in a climate change pact. But if I'm invested in making sure that he has a way to deliver his people out of poverty while still dealing with climate change, then it's possible to get something done. Third point, we have to recognize that on the world stage, our biggest threat is not the great power contests of the past, but is rather emanating from failed states, rogue states, terrorist networks, disaffection in places like the Middle East. Recently, we've seen the challenges that we face from North Korea. That's a real danger. That's not one that was just created by the recent U.S. administration. But what is also true is that addressing that danger is going to require more than military strategy. It's going to require more than just maintaining our technological edge. It's also going to require strong diplomacy and nurturing and maintaining alliances. And as Americans, we've been very proud in the past of the way that we've worked with Canada and our other critical allies to make the world a safer and more just and more prosperous place. We are bound together by the service of those who defended us from World War I to World War II, to Afghanistan, to Iraq. And we have been united in building institutions that help keep the peace, from the United Nations to NATO, to the web of commerce that stretches from one end of this continent to the other, the longest peaceful border on Earth. So we know how to do this, but it doesn't happen by itself. We have to couple our extraordinary military power with the power of our ideals and our willingness to invest in those international institutions that can help to shrink the circles of fear and despair and create a more hopeful future for people beyond our borders. Fourth, we're going to have to help to rebuild the consensus around the openness to immigrants and refugees. And Toronto, like my hometown of Chicago, is a great example of the incredible vibrancy and power and dynamism that arises as a consequence of immigrant populations. In America, immigrants start about 30% of all new businesses. But what we also have to recognize is that new immigrants can, in some circumstances, in certain markets, compete for services and construction jobs that previously had gone to low-wage workers in those areas. And when folks feel that immigration is not orderly or fair, then it puts at risk our ability to sustain our future as a nation of immigrants. So for the sake of our economies and our values, we have to work both in our own countries and work with Europe and work in other advanced economies to establish a fair, orderly system of immigration that reflects our compassion, reflects our interest in attracting talent from all around the world, but also ensures that people still view our process as a lawful one. And finally, we've got to recognize the way technology is changing how people consume information. The fact that we are more connected than ever also makes it easier for us to retreat into our own information bubbles, to listen to people who think just like we do, to never challenge our own assumptions. We become so secure in our beliefs that we tend to fit the facts to fit our opinions rather than base our opinions on readily available facts and evidence and reason. And I'm an old-fashioned guy. I believe in the Enlightenment.